Hey guys, tonight we're heading back, way back, before castles, before crowns, before anyone decided powdered wigs were a good idea. Tonight, we're going to drift into the slow, smoky world of the average caveman. So dim the lights, maybe grab a blanket, pretend your central heating is just a slightly cooperative mammoth hide, and let's gently wander into prehistory, where dinner might chase you, and your biggest home renovation project is moving 3 rocks slightly to the left. Now, when we say caveman, we usually picture a grunting man with a club, possibly wearing a leopard print tunic that somehow survived 40,000 years in perfect condition. But real life was quieter, slower, and honestly, much more ordinary than cartoons would have you believe. Most of the humans we're talking about lived during the Paleolithic period. That's the Old Stone Age, which sounds dramatic, but really it just means we haven't figured out metal yet. For tens of thousands of years, daily life was built around 3 main concerns: food, warmth, and not getting eaten. That's it. That's the to-do list. Let's start with the morning. There were no alarms, no calendars, no emails, no meetings that could have been a rock carving.
Aye, to the tales
You
of
woke
old.
up because the sun rose, or because it was cold, or because something outside made a noise that sounded suspiciously like teeth. Most people did not actually live in caves full time. I know, it's disappointing. The term caveman is doing a lot of heavy lifting. Many groups lived in temporary shelters, simple huts made of wood, branches, animal hides, and sometimes mammoth bones. Imagine IKEA, but everything wants to kill you and there are no instructions. Caves were useful though, especially in colder regions. A cave gave you shelter from wind, it gave you stable temperature, it gave you walls to paint on when you felt creative. And honestly, in a world without landlords, that's a win. Now, what did the average morning look like? Slow. Very slow. If you were part of a hunter-gatherer band, which most people were, you lived in a small group, maybe 20 to 40 individuals, extended family, a few unrelated members. Everyone knew everyone. There was no mysterious neighbor. If someone was weird, you'd known since birth. You'd wake up near the fire. Fires were precious. Keeping one alive overnight was serious business. You didn't want to start from scratch if you could avoid it. Making fire required skill, patience, and probably some mild swearing. The first order of business was warmth. Ice Age Europe, for example, was not exactly cozy. During colder phases, temperatures could be brutally low. Even in milder climates, mornings were cold. You wrapped yourself in animal skins, furs, whatever you had. Fashion was practical, and no one was judging your outfit because everyone was wearing the same thing. Breakfast wasn't cereal. There was no neat little bowl of grains. There were no pastries. There was whatever you had managed to secure the previous day. Maybe leftover roasted meat, maybe dried berries, maybe nuts, maybe nothing. Fasting was not a lifestyle choice. It was just Tuesday. And then came the central activity of the day, getting more food. Hunter-gatherer life was active, constantly active, but not in a gym membership way. No one was tracking steps, though if they had been, it would have been impressive. Men often participated in hunting large game, though that varied by region and culture. Women often gathered plant foods, which, and this is important, provided a huge portion of daily calories. The stereotype of man the hunter, woman waits around is wildly misleading. Gathering was skilled work. You had to know which plants were edible, which were medicinal, which would make you wish you had never been born. And this knowledge wasn't written down. It was passed through memory, through observation, through careful instruction. Imagine memorizing an entire botanical encyclopedia without paper, and then imagine teaching it to your children while also avoiding being trampled by a bison. Let's float over to hunting for a moment. Hunting was not a daily mammoth rodeo. It was long periods of walking, tracking, studying prints in mud, reading broken branches like clues. Patience was survival. If you were lucky, you might bring down a deer, or a wild horse, or in colder regions, reindeer. Large hunts required coordination, cooperation, communication. People developed complex social bonds because you had to. If your hunting partner didn't trust you, that was awkward and potentially fatal. Weapons were simple but effective. Spears, later spear throwers like the atlatl, stone blades, carefully shaped tools. Stone tools were everything. The Paleolithic period is divided into different phases largely based on tool complexity. Early stone tools were rough. Later ones became more refined, sharper, more specialized. Someone in your group was probably very good at knapping stone, carefully striking flint to create razor-sharp edges. It required skill. One wrong strike and the whole thing shattered. So yes, there was a specialist in the group, the resident rock genius, and he was probably very proud of it. Now, hunting was risky. Injuries happened, broken bones, cuts, sprains. But here's something interesting. Archaeological evidence shows that many injured individuals survived for years after serious trauma. That suggests care, community support. People didn't just abandon each other the moment someone became inconvenient, which is surprisingly wholesome. Life expectancy is often misunderstood. People didn't typically live to 80, but if you survived childhood, which was the real danger zone, you might live into your 50s or 60s. That's not ancient by modern standards. Childhood, though, was precarious. Infant mortality was high. Illness, infection, accidents. There were no antibiotics, no pediatricians, no quick check at urgent care. If you got sick, your immune system handled it, or it didn't. And yet children were central to life. They learned by watching, by imitating, by slowly participating in adult tasks. There were no formal schools, no homework. Learning was woven into daily survival. You didn't study plant identification. You followed your mother and absorbed it. You didn't take a hunting course. You walked with older hunters until you understood. It was immersion by education. Now, let's talk about social life, because cavemen were not silent brutes staring into space. They talked a lot.
Language in some form existed long before the late Paleolithic. Complex communication was essential. Coordinating hunts, teaching tool-making, forming alliances, you needed language. Even Neanderthals, who lived alongside early modern humans, likely had some capacity for speech. Their hyoid bones, involved in speech, suggest as much. And yes, Neanderthals interbred with Homo sapiens. So if you have European or Asian ancestry today, there's a decent chance you carry a little Neanderthal DNA. Congratulations, your family tree just got deeper. Evenings were communal. After a day of movement, people gathered around the fire. They cooked, they repaired tools, they processed hides, they told stories. Storytelling may have been one of the earliest forms of entertainment. Imagine sitting in flickering firelight, shadows dancing on cave walls, someone recounting a hunt, or a near miss with a predator, or a memory of an ancestor. Stories helped pass knowledge, but they also built identity. You weren't just surviving, you were part of a group, a lineage, a shared narrative. Art appears surprisingly early. Cave paintings, like those at Lascaux in France, show animals rendered with impressive detail: bison, horses, deer. These weren't crude stick figures. They were careful, observational, intentional. Which tells us something important. The average caveman had imagination. They weren't just reacting to hunger. They were reflecting, creating, expressing. Why paint deep inside caves? We're not entirely sure. Ritual? Teaching tool? Spiritual practice? A very committed hobby? Whatever the reason, it required time, which means life wasn't constant chaos. There were moments of stillness, of creative pause. Now, hygiene. Let's address it gently. There were no toothbrushes, no scented soaps, no deodorant promising glacial freshness. But people weren't rolling in mud all day either. They bathed in rivers, they groomed. Lice combs have been found archaeologically. Cleanliness mattered, especially in close-knit groups where disease could spread quickly. Teeth were often worn down from gritty food, but cavities were less common before agriculture introduced heavy starch diets. So, ironically, your average hunter-gatherer might have had fewer cavities than a medieval noble with a sweet tooth, which is a quiet victory. Let's drift into sleep. There were no mattresses, no memory foam, no bedtime podcasts, except this one, of course. You slept on furs, on plant bedding, often near the fire for warmth and safety. Sleep cycles likely followed natural light patterns, longer sleep in winter, shorter in summer. And yes, there were dangers at night, predators, rival groups, sudden storms. But humans evolved in this rhythm. The darkness wasn't an abstract fear, it was familiar. Over time, communities developed territories, familiar landscapes, seasonal routes. You knew where the berries ripened, where herds migrated, where water pooled during dry months. The world was mapped in memory. There were no borders, no passports, just landscapes and pathways. Conflict did happen. Evidence of violence exists, healed skull fractures, embedded spear points. But it wasn't constant warfare. Small groups often avoided direct confrontation. The risk was too high. Diplomacy probably looked less like treaties and more like cautious distance. Now, let's talk about food variety. Hunter-gatherer diets were incredibly diverse. Depending on region, people ate fish, seafood, birds, small mammals, roots, fruits, seeds, insects. Yes, insects. High in protein, surprisingly efficient. So next time you complain about broccoli, just remember, at least it isn't roasted beetle. Seasons shaped everything. Winter meant scarcity in colder climates. Food had to be dried or smoked. Fat was precious. Body fat helped survival. Spring brought renewal, new plant growth, migrating animals. Summer was abundance, long days, plenty of gathering. Autumn meant preparation, storing what you could, building up reserves. Life was cyclical, predictable in its unpredictability. And through it all, people formed relationships, partnerships, bonds. Marriage as a formal institution didn't exist in the way we think of it, but pair bonding did. Families formed. Children were raised collectively. There's evidence that older individuals, grandparents, played important roles. The grandmother hypothesis suggests that postmenopausal women contributed significantly to group survival by helping care for grandchildren. So yes, grandma has always been important. Spiritual life likely existed too. Burial practices show care, grave goods, flowers placed with the dead. This suggests belief, or at least reverence. Death was part of daily reality, but it wasn't necessarily hidden. It was acknowledged, integrated. And perhaps that made it less terrifying. The average caveman's life was not glamorous. It was physically demanding, sometimes harsh, often uncertain. But it was also deeply connected to land, to community, to rhythm. There were no spreadsheets, no deadlines, no performance reviews. Your value was immediate and tangible. Could you contribute? Could you cooperate? Could you share? And when you think about it, that's not entirely different from us. We've added skyscrapers, smartphones, social media, but at the core, we still wake up, seek food, seek warmth, seek connection. We just don't have to outrun a saber-toothed cat on the way to the grocery store, which frankly is progress. So tonight, as you settle into your very modern bed with your climate control and your reassuring walls, imagine a small fire flickering against stone. Imagine the quiet breathing of a sleeping group. Imagine a world without traffic, without notifications, without meetings that definitely could have been avoided. Just stars overhead and the slow, steady rhythm of survival. In the next part, we'll gently wander deeper into Ice Age winters and what it really took to survive when the cold wasn't just uncomfortable, but world-shaping. But for now, rest. The mammoths can wait.
All right, welcome back. The fire is still glowing. The wind outside is still doing that dramatic Ice Age howl. And tonight, we're going to gently lean into one of the biggest challenges the average caveman ever faced. Cold. Not forgot your jacket cold, not car won't start cold, but the kind of cold that reshapes landscapes, the kind that quietly covers half a continent in ice and says very calmly, adapt or don't. During the last ice age, particularly the last glacial maximum around 20,000 years ago, enormous ice sheets covered much of northern Europe and North America. We're talking miles thick ice, entire regions transformed into frozen silence. And yet, humans stayed, which is either impressive or slightly stubborn. Let's float into a winter morning somewhere in Ice Age Europe. You wake before sunrise, not because you want to, but because the cold has crept into your bones. The fire burned low overnight. Someone stirs it carefully, adds fuel, coaxes it back to life. Fire was everything. It wasn't optional, it wasn't decorative, it was survival itself. Keeping a steady supply of fuel in a frozen landscape required planning. Wood wasn't always abundant in glacial environments. In some areas, people burned bone, especially large mammoth bones, because fat-rich bone burned surprisingly well. Yes, mammoth bone fireplaces were a thing. Imagine explaining that to your modern interior designer. Shelters in colder regions became more sophisticated. Archaeologists have uncovered structures made from mammoth bones arranged in circular patterns, covered with hides. These weren't random piles, they were engineered. A mammoth bone dwelling was insulation, architecture, and recycling all in one. Inside, space was tight but efficient. Sleeping areas lined with furs, tools organized, food stored carefully to avoid attracting predators. Because here's the thing, winter made everyone hungry, not just humans. Wolves, cave lions, hyenas, they were all navigating the same frozen buffet shortage, which meant vigilance never really switched off. Clothing became highly specialized. Animal hides weren't just thrown over shoulders, they were scraped, cleaned, softened, sewn together using bone needles and sinew thread. Yes, bone needles. That level of detail tells us something important. Ice Age humans weren't clumsy survivalists, they were skilled craftspeople. Tailored clothing allowed layered insulation, fur turned inward for warmth, waterproof outer layers for snow, boots stuffed with dry grass for added insulation, functional fashion, and no one was complaining about trends. Let's gently walk into the food question.
Winter reduced plant availability dramatically in colder regions, so diets leaned heavily on animal protein and fat. Fat was precious. Lean meat alone isn't enough in freezing climates. The body needs fat for calories and warmth. Hunters prized fatty cuts. Marrow inside bones was a calorie treasure chest. Cracking open bones for marrow wasn't just a random habit, it was strategic. In Arctic regions, later hunter-gatherers would even consume raw or lightly fermented meat to preserve nutrients. Cooking is wonderful, but sometimes winter doesn't care about culinary preferences. Preservation techniques mattered. Meat could be dried in cold air, frozen naturally, stored underground. Smoke curing helped extend shelf life. Food storage required planning months ahead. A failed autumn hunt could echo into February in unpleasant ways. And yet, evidence suggests that many groups managed remarkably well. Mobility was key. Humans didn't stay planted in one spot year-round. They followed herds, adjusted routes, shifted camps seasonally. Reindeer migrations, for example, were crucial in parts of Europe. Following predictable animal movements meant predictable food. Which brings us to cooperation. Ice Age survival demanded coordination. Large hunts required group strategy, surrounding herds, driving animals toward natural traps like cliffs or marshy ground. It wasn't chaotic screaming with clubs. It was organized, communication, timing, trust. You didn't want to mistime a spear throw when the target weighed a few thousand pounds. Now let's soften the scene for a moment. Even in winter, there were pauses. Days when the sky was clear, snow reflecting sunlight in blinding brilliance, children playing near camp, adults repairing tools, reworking spear tips, carving small objects. Art didn't disappear in winter. Portable art, small carved figurines, decorated tools, appears throughout the Upper Paleolithic. Some of the famous Venus figurines date to these cold periods. Creation continued even when breath froze in the air, which suggests something deeply human. Survival didn't eliminate imagination. Now, illness in winter was dangerous. Respiratory infections, frostbite, malnutrition. Without modern medicine, healing relied on herbal knowledge and community care. Certain plants with medicinal properties were known and used long before pharmacies existed. And again, archaeological evidence shows healed injuries, individuals who survived broken limbs in harsh climates. That only happens with support. Someone gathered food for them, someone kept them warm. Community wasn't sentimental, it was practical, but it was real. Let's drift toward the psychological side. Winter darkness stretches long in higher latitudes, limited daylight, extended cold. Modern humans sometimes struggle with seasonal depression despite heated homes and streaming services. Ice Age humans faced it with firelight and conversation. Storytelling likely intensified during winter months. Oral traditions passed long evenings. Myths formed. Explanations for seasons, animals, stars. The sky itself was clearer in glacial air, constellations sharper, the Milky Way bright enough to cast faint shadows. Imagine lying on frozen ground, wrapped in furs, staring at a sky untouched by artificial light.
A quiet kind of awe. Now, let's gently acknowledge risk without dramatizing it. Blizzards happened, sudden temperature drops, ice storms. If a storm destroyed shelter, rebuilding was urgent. Exposure could be fatal. But humans are problem solvers. Snow itself can insulate. Windbreaks can be built from packed snow. Later Arctic cultures perfected snow structures like igloos, but even earlier groups understood basic insulation principles. Layering, blocking wind, conserving heat.
It's less glamorous than heroic battle scenes, but arguably more impressive. Winter also shaped social bonds. In small bands, tension could build, limited space, shared stress, but cooperation remained essential. Conflict resolution likely relied on discussion, mediation by elders, subtle social pressures. Because exile in winter was not an appealing option, the environment encouraged cohesion. Now, you might wonder, was life just constant struggle? Not exactly. There were rhythms within winter, periods of success. A large hunt could provide weeks of security, shared meals, celebration in quiet ways. Laughter probably existed. Not sitcom laughter, but soft, tired, satisfied laughter. And then there's adaptation over generations. Genetic adaptations to cold, body proportions suited to conserving heat, cultural innovations, all accumulated slowly. Humans didn't conquer the Ice Age in one dramatic moment. They adjusted. Tiny improvements, slightly better clothing, more efficient tools, better knowledge of migration patterns. Incremental survival, which is honestly how most human progress works. By late winter, anticipation of spring must have been powerful. Longer daylight, melting snow, return of plant life, migrating birds, relief, quiet and steady. And when we step back and look at it from a modern perspective, something becomes clear. The average caveman was not constantly panicked. They were busy, focused, physically engaged with their world. Their challenges were immediate and tangible. Cold air on skin, hunger in stomach, fire in front of them. No abstract worries about interest rates, no inbox full of unread messages, just the steady negotiation with nature. And somehow they managed. They raised children, they created art, they told stories, they buried their dead with care in a frozen world. So as we let this Ice Age scene fade, imagine the fire glowing steadily, mammoth hide walls holding back the wind, snow drifting quietly outside. Inside, a small group breathes in unison, safe for tonight. In the next part, we'll wander into something equally fascinating, how relationships, family life, and childhood really worked in these small prehistoric communities. Because yes, even cavemen had family drama, but gentle drama, the sleepy kind. For now, let the Ice Age wind soften and rest.
All right. The fire is steady again. The winter wind has calmed down. No mammoths are currently charging the camp, which is always a nice, relaxing bonus. Tonight, let's drift into something a little softer. Not spears, not snowstorms, but family life. Because even in the deep past, even when survival required constant effort, humans still did what humans always do. They formed families. They argued a little. They raised children. They worried. They hoped. They probably sighed dramatically at least once a day. So what did family life actually look like for the average caveman? First, we need to gently let go of the cartoon image of a man dragging someone by the hair into a cave. Real prehistoric social structures were far more cooperative and far less theatrical. Most people lived in small bands of maybe 20 to 40 individuals. These were extended family groups, grandparents, siblings, cousins, a few in-laws, possibly that one unrelated guy who joined years ago and just sort of stayed. It was intimate. There was no such thing as anonymity. If you were in a bad mood, everyone knew. Pair bonding existed. Long-term partnerships between men and women were common, especially when children were involved. Raising a child in a hunter-gatherer society required serious investment.
Human babies are famously helpless. They take years to become even mildly independent. Which means cooperation wasn't optional, it was survival. And here's something fascinating. Anthropologists studying modern hunter-gatherer societies often observe what's called alloparenting. That's a fancy way of saying everyone helps raise the kids. Grandmothers gather extra food, older siblings carry toddlers, aunts soothe crying babies, uncles teach basic skills. Childcare was shared, which probably reduced stress, at least slightly. I mean, toddlers are still toddlers, even in 20,000 BCE. Now, let's imagine a typical caveman child. They weren't sitting quietly in a corner. They were watching everything. From the moment they could walk, they followed adults around camp, observing tool-making, listening to conversations, playing with small versions of real tools. There were no toy stores, but children likely had miniature bows, tiny spears, carved figurines. Learning was constant and subtle. A little girl walking with her mother while gathering plants would slowly absorb plant knowledge, which leaves sting, which roots nourish, which berries are a very bad idea. A little boy trailing older hunters would learn how to move quietly, how to read tracks, how to be patient. There were no lectures, no written tests, no report cards saying needs improvement in spear accuracy. Skills developed naturally over time. And because groups were small, children had strong attachment to multiple adults. That kind of social network likely created emotional resilience. Now, childhood wasn't endlessly idyllic. There were dangers, accidents, illness. But children weren't treated as burdens. Archaeological evidence suggests care and affection. Small burials with grave goods imply that even the youngest members were valued deeply, which feels very human. Let's gently turn to relationships between adults. Without written contracts or elaborate wedding ceremonies, partnerships were probably formed through mutual choice, family approval, and social bonds. Jealousy likely existed, so did arguments. Humans haven't changed that much. But in a small band, open conflict could destabilize the entire group, so social pressure likely encouraged resolution. Elders may have mediated disputes. Humor may have softened tensions. Imagine a quiet evening by the fire. Someone makes a slightly sarcastic comment about someone else's failed hunting attempt. A few tired chuckles, a gentle eye roll. Drama, but make it prehistoric. Division of labor existed, but it wasn't rigid in every context. While hunting large game was often male-dominated in many regions, women contributed heavily through gathering, small game hunting, food processing, tool production, clothing manufacture. In many environments, gathered plant foods made up the majority of daily calories. So the idea that men alone provided is, well, a bit exaggerated. Everyone provided. Let's float toward elders. If someone lived into their 50s or 60s, they were a treasure trove of knowledge. Migration patterns, weather cycles, dangerous territories, medicinal plants. Experience mattered. The grandmother hypothesis suggests that older women beyond childbearing years played a key evolutionary role by helping feed and protect grandchildren. Their contribution increased overall survival rates. So yes, Grandma has always quietly run the world. Elders may have also served as storytellers, carriers of myth and memory, the living archive. And in a world without writing, memory was power. Now, what about love?
Language love probably existed. Humans are wired for attachment. But love was intertwined with practicality. A reliable partner meant shared labor, shared childcare, shared survival. That doesn't mean affection was absent. Touch, closeness, shared laughter around the fire, these are ancient behaviors. Oxytocin didn't suddenly appear in the Renaissance. Let's gently address something many people wonder about: hygiene within family life. Living in close quarters requires cleanliness. Lice combs have been found archaeologically. Regular grooming likely occurred. Water sources were used for washing. Hides were scraped and cleaned. Personal care mattered, not for vanity, but for health. Now, imagine evening settling in. The group gathers, the fire glows, children grow drowsy. Someone is finishing stitching a fur garment with a bone needle. Someone else is sharpening a stone blade with slow, rhythmic movements. Conversations drift. Perhaps someone recounts an ancestor's bravery. Perhaps someone complains gently about sore feet. Perhaps a teenager rolls their eyes at advice that feels unnecessary. Yes, even in prehistory, teenagers were probably convinced they knew better. Some things are timeless. Seasonal gatherings may have brought multiple bands together occasionally. Exchange of goods, exchange of stories, possibly exchange of marriage partners to maintain genetic diversity. Social networks extended beyond one small camp, which reduced isolation. Now, let's softly consider loss. When someone died, burial practices suggest care. Bodies placed intentionally, sometimes with tools or ornaments, sometimes sprinkled with red ochre. Death wasn't hidden away, it was acknowledged within the community. Children would have grown up understanding its presence, not as a shocking interruption, but part of the cycle. And perhaps that shaped emotional resilience in ways we can only imagine. Family life wasn't easy. It required patience, cooperation, constant adjustment. But it also offered something profound: belonging. In a vast Ice Age landscape, where winds swept across open plains and glaciers loomed in the distance, a small circle of people around a fire meant safety. It meant shared warmth. It meant someone would notice if you didn't come back from gathering. That level of interdependence creates strong bonds. And while we often romanticize modern independence, there's something quietly powerful about knowing you are woven tightly into a group. So as we let this gentle prehistoric evening fade, imagine the slow breathing of sleeping children, the faint crackle of fire, an elder staring thoughtfully into embers. No castles, no crowns, no royal scandals, just ordinary humans, loving imperfectly, arguing occasionally, teaching patiently, trying their best in a world that demanded it. In the next part, we'll wander into something surprisingly sophisticated: the minds of these so-called primitive peoples, their art, their symbols, their possible spiritual beliefs. Because the average caveman was not just surviving, they were thinking. But for now, let the fire dim a little and rest.